My wife didn't just walk out on me. She left behind a meticulously crafted scheme that accused me of running a criminal network and landed me in the crosshairs of an internal probe. I was an architect who had spent his life building foundations. But now I was the one being buried under a massive, long-term sentence for crimes I never committed. My life used to be measured in increments of quiet contentment. The smell of coffee on a Sunday morning, the sound of Sarah laughing in the kitchen, and the modest, sturdy foundation of a career I'd spent a decade building. I was an architect, the kind who obsessed over blueprints and structural integrity. I believed that if you laid the bricks right, the house would stand against any storm. But I never accounted for the fact that sometimes the foundation is sabotaged from within. Sarah left on a Tuesday. There was no screaming, no shattered porcelain, no dramatic final monologue. She simply left a note on the granite countertop, its edges curling in the dry air. "I can't be the person you need me to be," it read. She took her clothes, her books, and, inexplicably, a handful of files from my home office. I was devastated, but I was naive. I thought love was a contract that could be renegotiated. I didn't realize she hadn't just left. She had initiated a demolition. 2 weeks later, the front door of my office burst open. It wasn't the police, it was the internal security team. They didn't ask questions. They moved with the cold, calculated efficiency of people who had already decided I was guilty. They tore through my hard drives, dismantled my drafting tables, and dragged me out in handcuffs while my colleagues watched, their faces blurred by a haze of shock and confusion. I sat in a sterile, white-tiled room for 48 hours, listening to the heavy drone of fluorescent lights. When the interrogator finally entered, he dropped a thick manila folder on the table. He didn't speak about architectural schematics. He spoke about a complex, shadow-driven organized scheme that had been funneling illicit assets through my firm's accounts for years. They accused me of laundering millions, of being the silent architect for a criminal network that dealt in illegal weapons and dangerous, prohibited substances. The weight of it was suffocating. I kept shouting that it was a mistake, that I was an architect, not a criminal mastermind. But the evidence was damning. Someone had carefully mirrored my digital signature, accessed my private servers, and placed the weight of an organized scheme squarely on my shoulders. I was staring down a massive, looming threat, a charge of such gravity that I was looking at decades of my life vanishing into a concrete cage. They called it a conspiracy, a massive attempt to bury me under a weight of accusations that I couldn't possibly clear without the one person who had vanished into thin air. I spent months in a holding cell, watching the days bleed into gray, aimless nights. My lawyer, a tired man with a briefcase full of broken promises, told me the prosecution had a smoking gun, a secure server log that linked my personal login to an offshore account brimming with evidence of prohibited transactions. It was a digital ghost, a perfect forgery that I had no idea how to explain. My world, my reputation, and my sanity were being shredded to pieces by a ghost I had once shared a bed with. Just as the judge began the final motions of the trial, just as the walls of my prison seemed to be closing in to claim me for good, a letter arrived. It wasn't postmarked from a prison or a government office. It was a simple cream-colored envelope. I tore it open with trembling hands, the scent of lavender, her scent, wafting out like a ghost from a past life. "I know how to clear your name," the note began, written in that elegant, flowing script I had once traced with my own fingers. "I know who framed you, and I know where the actual evidence of their scheme is hidden. But you have to choose, Mark. You can let them take you down, or you can come to the coordinates I've attached below. If you come alone, I'll hand you the keys to your freedom. If you bring anyone, or if you tell a soul, we both disappear forever." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Was this another trap? A way to lure me into a confession of guilt I didn't possess? I stared at the map she had included, a remote, overgrown patch of woods miles outside the city, a place where people didn't go to be found. I stood up, the metal chair screeching against the floor, and looked at the guard. My lawyer had given up. The prosecution was ready for the kill, and I had nothing left to lose. I took a deep breath, clutching the map, and made a decision that would either be my salvation or the final piece of the puzzle that would seal my fate. I pushed the cell door open, not knowing that waiting for me at those coordinates wasn't just Sarah, but the shadow of the man who had truly orchestrated my downfall. The damp air of the forest clung to my skin like a shroud as I reached the coordinates Sarah had provided. Every step felt like walking into a snare. My internal alarm was screaming, a primal, jagged sound that pulsed in my temples, warning me that a man who had already lost his reputation, his assets, and his future was the perfect prey for a predator. The forest was unnervingly silent, the kind of stillness that suggests all the birds and small creatures have fled, sensing something unnatural. I reached the heart of the coordinates, a crumbling, abandoned hunting cabin that looked like a jagged tooth protruding from the earth. The wood was rotted, the windows broken out, and the structure groaned under the weight of an approaching storm. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the rusted handle, my mind flooded with the memory of the life I had before the accusations of being part of an organized scheme had destroyed everything. Was Sarah really here, or had I been summoned to my own execution? I shoved the door open. It creaked in protest, revealing a dim, dusty interior illuminated only by the gray, sickly light of an overcast afternoon. And there she was. She looked older, her face lined with the weight of years I hadn't shared with her, her eyes scanning the room with the frantic intensity of a trapped animal. She wasn't the woman I had married. She was a stranger wearing the skin of someone I had loved. "You came," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry leaves. She was holding a heavy, battered briefcase, her knuckles white from the strain. "Don't," I snapped, my voice echoing off the rotting floorboards. "Don't pretend this is about love or redemption. You destroyed my life, Sarah. I've spent months in a cell waiting for a trial that's designed to bury me under a massive long-term sentence for crimes I didn't commit. You were the one with the access codes. You were the one who mirrored my digital signature. Tell me why, or I swear I'll walk out that door and let them put me in the ground." She flinched, but she didn't look away. "I didn't have a choice, Mark. The group, they found out about my brother's debt. They didn't just want money. They wanted a ghost, someone in a position of power whose life they could systematically dismantle to cover their own tracks. They made me do it. They told me that if I didn't frame you, they would make sure you never walked free, and they would see to it that I suffered 10 times worse." I took a step closer, my fury burning white-hot. "So you sold me out to save yourself? You built an organized scheme around my desk, using my credentials to facilitate their operations involving prohibited substances and weapons, and now you're asking for my kindness?" "I'm not asking for kindness," she said, her voice dropping to a desperate tremor. "I'm asking for a trade. I have the drive. It's all in here. The evidence of their entire network, The real accounts, the names of the people in the service of internal security who have been on their payroll for years. If you take this to the right people, it won't just exonerate you. It will tear their organization apart. She held the briefcase out toward me. I reached for it, my hand inches from the leather, when a sharp metallic click echoed from the shadows behind the kitchen partition. It was the distinct, unmistakable sound of a firearm being readied. Sarah's face drained of all color, her gaze shifting to a point behind me. She didn't scream. She just let out a long, shuddering breath. "I told you to come alone, Mark," she whispered, a tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. "But I didn't tell you that I wasn't the only one who knew where this place was." I froze, the air in the room turning ice cold. From the darkness of the corner, a figure emerged, shrouded in the shadows of the rotting rafters. It was a man I recognized instantly, a high-ranking lead investigator from the agency that had been orchestrating the case against me from day one. He wasn't there to offer justice. He was there to close the loop. "You really shouldn't have been so curious, Mark," the investigator said, his voice smooth, professional, and terrifyingly devoid of empathy. This was supposed to be a simple, clean termination of an ongoing investigation, but it seems your ex-wife decided to play hero at the 11th hour. He took another step into the dim light, the weapon steady in his grip. I looked at Sarah, then at the briefcase, and then at the man who represented the law I had once trusted. The trap hadn't been set by Sarah alone. It was a coordinated strike, and as the man raised his weapon, leveling it squarely at my chest, I realized with a sickening clarity that the only way to survive was to do the one thing I had promised myself I would never do: descend into the darkness I had spent my life trying to outrun. My heart skipped a beat, not out of fear, but out of a sudden, desperate realization that the floorboards beneath us were rigged with something far more volatile than just a criminal secret. The light in the room shifted, and beneath the investigator's feet I saw the glint of a tripwire I had somehow missed, connected to a heavy improvised explosive device buried in the foundation. One wrong move, one sudden sound, and everything, the evidence, the investigator, Sarah, and I, would be erased from history. I stared at him, my finger inches from the trigger of the situation, as he began to squeeze. The silence in the cabin was so thick it felt like physical pressure. The investigator, a man whose name I'd seen on every legal document that had ruined my life, stood with his arm extended, his finger curled around the trigger. I knew he was cold, but the look in his eyes was something else. It was the boredom of a man who had ended dozens of careers and lives with the same methodical indifference. He didn't care about the law. He didn't care about justice. He cared about the structural integrity of the organized scheme he was protecting, and I was the structural flaw that needed to be hammered out. "Don't," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind howling through the broken rafters. She was trembling, her hand still clutched to the briefcase that held the key to my life or my death. "Step aside, Sarah," the man said, his voice flat. "You were always the weak link. I warned you that sentimentality would lead to a catastrophic error. Now watch as I tidy up this mess." My mind raced. I was an architect. I saw the world in beams, loads, and stress points. My eyes darted to the floor beneath the investigator's boots. The tripwire was thin, almost invisible, but the way the floorboards sagged told me everything I needed to know about the payload buried in the crawl space. It wasn't just a threat, it was an anchor, a fail-safe designed to destroy the cabin and everything in it if the wrong person discovered their secret. I had a choice. I could plead, I could scramble, or I could use the only language I had left, the logic of construction. If I shifted the weight, if I forced him to move just 6 inches to the left, I could trigger the mechanism before he had the chance to pull the trigger on his weapon. It was a gamble with a 0% margin for error. "You think you're in control?" I said, my voice steadying. I took a deliberate step toward him. He flinched, his aim wavering for a fraction of a second. "You've spent your career building lies, but you never learned how to support them. You think you've got me cornered, but you're standing on the very thing that's going to bring your entire career down." "Stay back, architect," he spat, his eyes narrowing. He was rattled. He knew something was off. He could feel the vibration of the floorboards beneath him. "You're a professional," I goaded, taking another slow step, putting myself squarely in the line of his sight. "But you're a sloppy one. You left a trail. You let Sarah get away. You think you're here to tie up loose ends, but you're just adding a new one." He took a step forward, his boot catching the lip of a loose board. I saw the tripwire tighten. This was it. I didn't lunge for him. I lunged for the support pillar behind him, bracing my weight against it and kicking the base with every ounce of frustration and betrayal I had been holding on to for months. The floor groaned, a sickening wooden screech that filled the small space. The investigator lost his balance, his arms windmilling as he tried to regain his footing. He didn't fire. He fell backward, his weight landing squarely on the pressure-sensitive board connected to the explosive charge. The sound wasn't like in the movies. There was no cinematic roar. There was only a violent, deafening thump as the floorboards disintegrated. The cabin dropped, a chaotic blur of dust, splinters, and light. I felt the wind being ripped from my lungs as I was thrown backward into the overgrown brush. Outside, everything went dark for a heartbeat. When I opened my eyes, the world was spinning. The cabin was a smoldering ruin of twisted timber and black smoke. My ears were ringing, a high-pitched whine that drowned out the sound of the forest. I struggled to my feet, my clothes torn, blood dripping from a gash on my forehead. I scanned the wreckage. There was no sign of the investigator. There was no sign of the briefcase. Then I heard it, a faint, ragged gasping coming from the debris. I scrambled toward the pile of timber, throwing aside heavy planks with frantic strength. I found her. Sarah was buried under a collapsed beam, her face pale, her breathing shallow. But she was clutching something against her chest. "Mark," she wheezed, her eyes searching mine. She shoved a charred, scorched leather bag into my hands. "Take it. Run. He wasn't alone. They're coming. The whole network. They heard the explosion." I looked toward the tree line and my blood turned to ice. Through the haze of smoke, I saw the flicker of flashlights. Not one or two, but a dozen, moving in a tactical formation, cutting through the darkness of the woods. They weren't police. They moved with the cold, silent precision of the organized group that had spent years ensuring no one ever stood up against them, and they were heading straight for us. I looked at the briefcase, then back at Sarah, and realized the evidence wasn't just a document, it was a death warrant. As the first flashlight beam swept over the ruin, landing squarely on my face, I realized I hadn't escaped the trap. I had just run into the middle of the spider's web. The blinding white light pinned me to the wreckage like a specimen under a microscope. My vision blurred, the ringing in my ears intensifying as a group of figures emerged from the tree line. They didn't shout. They didn't call for backup. They moved with the eerie, mechanical silence of an organized scheme that had operated in the shadows for far too long. Each of them wore dark, nondescript tactical gear, their faces obscured by balaclavas. I looked down at Sarah. She was fading, her grip on my arm loosening. "They're here for the drive," she whispered, her voice a mere ghost of a sound. "If they get it, you don't just go to prison, Mark. You cease to exist." I gripped the charred briefcase to my chest and scrambled backward, using the uneven terrain of the ruined cabin as cover. I had seconds. My training as an architect wasn't just about building. It was about understanding flow, structural load, and the weakest points in any system. I scanned the perimeter. The forest floor was uneven, cluttered with old-growth roots and the remnants of the cabin's foundation. If I could reach the old root cellar behind the main structure, I might stand a chance. The first volley of shots rang out, not loud but muffled, professional. I felt the sharp sting of wood chips grazing my cheek as a bullet splintered the timber inches from my head. These weren't law enforcement. These were the enforcers of the very network that had framed me. They were here to sanitize the scene. I lunged, diving over a pile of broken masonry and sliding into the narrow, dark crevice that led toward the old cellar. My shoulder slammed against a stone wall, the pain blinding, but I kept moving. I could hear them closing in, their footsteps heavy and calculated. "Check the perimeter," one of them barked. A voice that sounded too much like the man who had just been blown to pieces in the cabin. My heart hammered against my ribs. Had he survived the blast, or was this his second in command? I reached the bottom of the cellar, panting, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and rot. I had to know what was in the bag. I fumbled with the scorched latches, my fingers slick with blood. As the lid popped open, I wasn't met with a mountain of documents, but with a single encrypted digital drive and a handwritten note. "If you're reading this, you're either dead or you're the smartest person I ever knew. The drive doesn't just contain their records. It contains the kill switch for their entire digital infrastructure. It's rigged to broadcast everything to the internal security servers the moment it connects to a network. But there's a catch. It requires a physical key, a biometric signature, mine." I looked at Sarah, who had somehow managed to crawl down the cellar entrance behind me. She was pale, her breathing irregular. "Sarah, you told me you were the one who betrayed me. Why give me the key? Why stay?" She looked at me, a sad, knowing smile touching her lips. "Because I'm already gone, Mark. Look at me." She pulled back her sleeve, revealing a series of chemical burns and deep, jagged bruising around her wrists, signs of long-term containment. Then she pulled a small silver device from her pocket. It wasn't just a key, it was a tracking beacon. She hadn't led me to safety. She had led them right to the source of the data, intending to be the distraction that allowed me to escape. "You have to go through the ventilation shaft," she hissed, pointing toward a narrow tunnel that led toward the creek. "It's the only way out. When you reach the road, you'll find a car. It's registered to me, but it's loaded with enough fake credentials to get you across the border. Go, Mark. Now!" I reached for her, wanting to pull her with me, but she pushed me back with a strength born of pure, distilled desperation. The men above had reached the cellar entrance. I heard the scraping of boots on stone and the cold, clicking sound of a magazine being loaded into a weapon. "I won't leave you," I started, but she shoved the drive into my hand. "You don't have a choice. If you stay, the evidence dies with us. If you go, they lose everything." I hesitated for one agonizing heartbeat. The cellar door overhead began to creak open, light spilling down like a judge's gavel. I lunged into the dark, narrow mouth of the ventilation shaft, my body scraping against the jagged metal. As I crawled, I heard the men drop into the cellar. I heard Sarah laugh, a hollow, defiant sound that made my skin crawl. "He's already gone," she whispered. I heard a sudden, violent struggle, then a single sharp sound that silenced everything. My blood turned to ice. I forced myself to keep moving, my heart breaking with every agonizing inch. I crawled until the light of the moon began to filter through the end of the shaft. I tumbled out into the cold night air, gasping for breath, clutching the drive like it was a holy relic. I stood up, shaking, and looked toward the road. There was a car parked there, just as she had promised. But as I sprinted toward it, I stopped dead in my tracks. A black sedan pulled up, its headlights cutting through the darkness, blocking my path. A man stepped out, someone I recognized from the initial investigation, someone who had stood in the courtroom while I was being humiliated. He wasn't holding a gun, he was holding a badge, and he was smiling. "You've been a very difficult man to find, Mark," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "But thanks to the beacon, you've made it remarkably easy to finish what we started." He reached into his coat, and as he pulled out a set of cuffs, he looked past me at the burning cabin in the distance. "It's a shame about your ex-wife. She really was the best asset we ever had." I stood there, the drive in my hand, realizing the trap wasn't just the woods, it was the entire world, and I was the only person left to reveal the truth if I could just get past the man who had been holding the leash the entire time. I took a step back, the drive burning in my palm, and realized that my only way out was to fight a war I wasn't prepared for. But then, my phone, a device I'd thought was dead, began to ring, an unknown number lighting up the dark with a message that changed everything. The ringtone was sharp, an electronic shriek that cut through the silence of the clearing. The man with the badge paused, his hand hovering over his holster. He looked at me, then at the phone in my hand, his eyes narrowing. "Don't answer that," he warned, his voice a low, gravelly threat. "You're already in deep enough. Whatever you think you have, it's nothing compared to the weight of an organized network that controls the very ground you're standing on." I didn't listen. My thumb swiped the screen. A voice filled the air, cold, precise, and entirely unexpected. It wasn't Sarah. It was the lead internal investigator, the man I thought had perished in the explosion, the man who had supposedly been on the payroll of the criminal ring from day one. "The beacon you're carrying, Mark, isn't a locator for them," the voice crackled through the speaker. "It's a broadcast signal. Everything you've been doing for the last hour, every move you've made, every confession Sarah whispered in that cellar is currently being streamed directly to the internal security headquarters. The entire tactical team you saw in those woods, they aren't criminals. They're the cleanup crew for the rot inside the agency. You haven't been fighting a secret group. You've been caught in the crossfire of an internal purge." The man in front of me stiffened. He wasn't reaching for handcuffs anymore. He was reaching for a weapon. But before he could draw, the sky erupted. Not with an explosion, but with the blinding glare of high-powered spotlights from a helicopter hovering silently above the tree line. "Drop the weapon!" a voice boomed from the sky, amplified and authoritative. The man holding the badge froze, his bravado shattering. He looked up at the helicopter, then back at me, his face a mask of panicked realization. He wasn't the hunter anymore. He was the prey. Within seconds, shadows descended from the trees. Not the black-clad figures from before, but professional, uniformed officers, weapons drawn and aimed with perfect, unwavering precision. I watched as they swarmed the clearing. The man was brought to his knees, his badge stripped, his face pressed into the dirt. I stood there, trembling, the encrypted drive still gripped in my hand. Sarah. The thought of her hit me like a physical blow. She had been the bait, yes, but she had also been the architect of this entire dangerous gambit. She knew I would never break unless the walls were closing in, and she had meticulously engineered a scenario where I would be forced to lead them into the very trap she had set for the corrupt officials who had ruined my life. One of the lead agents approached me, his expression unreadable. He didn't take the drive by force. He reached out a gloved hand, waiting. "You have no idea what you've just accomplished, Mark," he said quietly. "Sarah wasn't just an asset. She was our best deep-cover operative. She sacrificed everything to ensure that this organized scheme was dismantled from within. Her life was never hers to keep once she infiltrated them. She knew that today was the end of the line." My breath hitched. Where is she? The agent didn't look at the burning cabin. He looked at the horizon. "She's safe, but she can never be the woman you knew again. The person you married died the moment she stepped into that forest to save you." Weeks later, the fallout was absolute. The scandal broke like a dam, flooding the news cycles. My name was cleared, the charges were dropped, and the architect was no longer the villain in a criminal conspiracy, but a man who had survived a nightmare of someone else's making. I sat in a new office in a different city, looking at a set of blueprints for a home I'd never built. I was free, my assets restored, my reputation salvaged by the weight of the evidence Sarah had handed me that final, terrifying night. But the silence in my life was different now. It was no longer the quiet contentment of a Sunday morning. It was the heavy, contemplative silence of a survivor. I walked to my desk and opened the final package Sarah had sent me, a small, nondescript envelope that arrived with no return address. Inside was a single Polaroid of the two of us, taken on our wedding day, and a small antique key to a safety deposit box. On the back of the photo, she had written only 4 words: "Build something worth keeping." I realized then that she hadn't just destroyed my life to save it. She had demolished the foundation of a life that was built on a lie, giving me the materials to start over from scratch. I stood up, walked to the window, and watched the sunrise. I was no longer the man who needed someone else to complete his design. I was the architect of my own recovery. I took the key, put it in my pocket, and for the first time in years, I didn't look back at the wreckage. I turned to my drafting table, picked up my pencil, and began to draw the first line of a new, authentic future. The storm had passed, the structure was sound, and for once the house I was building was entirely my own.